So we're one step towards proving Faulkner wrong. We can't understand the South. We know what it is now. So the next piece we're going to talk about is what's happening in the South, right? And right now, the South is undergoing one of the biggest and dramatic changes in its history. No question asked. This is one of those turning point moments in the South. Now, if Hollis and some others had a nickel for every time we were told the new South is right around the corner, right, and big change is coming, we'd be loaded, right? But really, this is one of those important turning point moments, and this is what we're going to talk about now. So how is the South changing? Well, first of all, it's dramatically growing. The census, we all knew the South was growing, but the census just put an exclamation point on how fast it was happening. Half of the states are growing the fastest, and because the southern states are bigger, that's where most of the growth is happening. That growth translates into political power, right? And so after 2010, you saw the South gain 8 congressional seats and electoral college votes and become the center of political gravity shifting to southern states. And this is a little game you could play, and I was just working with this a couple days ago. How easy would it be today to win the presidency without using the South? I don't know if anybody's a math genius here. But what it would take. So this is really, the states that are locked up for Obama, states that are locked up for Romney. Take the South out of the equation. How easy would it be to win the presidency if you didn't use any of the southern states?
What are you suggesting?
What am I getting at? So Romney, would Romney have a chance? No. He couldn't get to 270 electoral college votes without the southern states. How easy would it be for the Obama campaign to win the election without any of the southern states? I know we can't do like that math on the fly, but not too easy, right? He'd have to win about 2/3 of all the other states. He'd have to be in the going for Arizona, for Missouri, to get to that 270. So in other words, this is the situation now where the South has 1/3 of the electoral college vote. So no longer is it an option to not include the South in a national political strategy. It's just not an option anymore. But let's talk a little bit more about how, well, and of course the parties know this, which is why they had their conventions in Florida and North Carolina just a few weeks ago. So how is the South changing? So let's talk about this a little bit. A lot was talked after the census about how it's newcomers, right, that are changing the South. And this is definitely true. This is a chart we did that looks at how much of the growth we saw over the last 10 years was from people coming from other parts of the world or from the country, migration or immigration. And you can definitely see a state like Florida, some of the states, North Carolina, Alabama, how much that's a factor in what makes up these states today. And even some of the states like Texas, it's a huge factor in kind of shaping the new demographics. Of course, one of the ones that got the biggest attention was the growth in the Latino communities over the last 10 years. And you see how the southern states dominated the list of states that grew the fastest in the Latino communities. And one of the big factors of that is that it's helping shift politics in the South to urban areas, to cities in many of the southern states. And this is how Latino communities were growing when you look at the growth there. And then this is a chart I had to redo last night because my PowerPoint got eaten, but this gives you a sense of how much electoral power that translates into right now. And of course, that's going to be growing in the coming years. The other part of the story that I don't think got told as much after the 2010 census was growth in African American communities in the South. Today, half of the nation's African Americans live in those 13 southern states, concentrated, if you go back to that map we saw before, in the Black Belt in North Carolina. And how much of this was not just communities that were in the South, but also return migration, which we talked about over here. One of the big stories of the South all of last century, from 1900 to the 1970s, 20 million people left the South, right? Largely African Americans to escape Jim Crow and racial persecution. Also whites who are fed up with the economic situation. That has reversed. And now return migration is one of the biggest drivers of growth in the South today. And you see that especially in the cities, again, that grew. And that narrative is very interesting and important. It was largely rural African Americans who left for Chicago, Gary, Indiana, Milwaukee, and then when they come back, moving to cities. So rural to urban in the South. Also, Asian American communities, some of the fastest growth nationally, were in southern cities. And what that adds up to is this, and this was referred to in the last presentation, the growth of a majority, what the census calls a majority people of color counties in the South. And this is the new majority that's forming. And the projection is that's going to double within a generation. The number of counties is going to double. So that's the horizon for when we're going to see this new Southern majority take shape. And you get to see how it's playing out in different states. But the real big overlay here is generational. This is what majority people of color counties look like for those who are 65 and older. And then you move into 18 to 34, and then the youngest Southerners, age 1 and under. And that's the horizon. We have one generation before the Southern new majority really takes hold. And that's driving, again, the growth in urban areas. And these are maps about where the biggest growth was in these southern states. Urban areas always dominating. But the key backdrop to that also is at the same time there's a disproportionate rural presence in southern states. And that's one of these contradictions that's happening in the South right now. Growth in the urban areas, growth as political power centers, but there's still a big rural presence. And you definitely saw that. North Carolina had a vote on an anti-gay marriage amendment. Huge divide between the cities and the rural areas and how that played out. So definitely there's huge change happening in the South. Any questions about that? All right, so that means the change is right around the corner, right? New South is right around the corner. Well, I think the next big piece of this story is that we know in a generation the South is going to look completely different, and that could translate into big change in political power. But there are huge barriers to realizing that potential. And part of it is a backlash, much like we saw during the period of Reconstruction or after the Black Freedom Movement with the Southern Strategy. We're seeing the same kind of pushback to the threat that new majority poses, trying to undermine and contain what this new majority might do. One of the most obvious, we just talked about it, assault on voting, right? This war on voting, voter ID laws, not just voter ID, but trying to shorten early voting, who can register, having a big impact on the ability of this new majority to exert political power. And this gives you just a sense of the number of people in these states that didn't have ID and what that compares to. Obviously a state like North Carolina, but South Carolina, 178,000 people who might not have ID, that's more than the margin that we saw in the presidential election last time around. Redistricting. How does redistricting undermine the power of the new majority?
Well, communities of color are concentrated in urban areas, and you can draw districts where their power is concentrated in one district but diluted throughout the state.
Right. So diluting the power of the new majority, right? And maybe hyper-concentrating it in a couple districts, but overall, the goal of redistricting in 2010 was to dilute the power of the new majority in southern states. These are the status of the maps in the different states. Here's a case study of North Carolina, where half of the people of color in that state were packed into 3 congressional districts, 10 of 50 state senate districts, 25 House districts. And so diluting the power of this clearly emerging new majority in the state. Texas, which just had its lines shot down for discrimination. If you look at the strategy in 2010 in these state legislatures, how much money and effort and focus went into ensuring that these legislatures were won or that they increased majorities so that they could make sure that this process got underway. And really the only stopping point right now has been the Voting Rights Act and litigation trying to push back, and what happened in Texas, where they said Texas could not prove that it did not intentionally try to discriminate against Latinos and African Americans in drawing those lines. Obviously, there's a lot of ways to talk about anti-immigrant legislation in the South, but I think one key frame to look at it is a way to assault the emerging new majority, right? Is that this is viewed as a key part of this new power bloc that's forming in the South, and that gives urgency to the need to push for these, amongst all the other reasons those are really pushed. And if you look, and this is at the federal level, about deportations, and this was raised in the earlier panel, how amazing that dramatically deportations have grown, especially in southern states. Grew by 300% out of these 2 ICE offices that were responsible for deporting. A huge increase that was disproportionate with some other parts in the country. Other big obstacle that I want to talk about quickly is obviously money in politics, right? Citizens United and the growing ability of people with big money to go against kind of the grain about what's forming, the way a state is trending. Colbert, of course, brought this to our attention with his coordinated PAC in South Carolina. Did a fantastic job that hours of CNN coverage could never do, and putting that on the agenda. We at the Institute for Southern Studies, who here has heard of Art Pope? All right, so this is a guy, he's Koch Jr., right? He co-leads Americans for Prosperity with the Koch brothers. But his focus is on state politics. And what he did in 2010 was phenomenal. His groups, these outside money groups, gave 75% of the outside money that flooded into state legislative elections. It all came from national sources that were wanting to get in charge of redistricting. That was the goal. Pope was the funnel for that money in North Carolina. So we, of course, had some fun kind of outing Art Pope. We had his Art Pope Exposed website. It led to some national coverage at Jane Mayer, The New Yorker, and Rachel Maddow. So we were able to put him in the national spotlight. But this was important because he is viewed as a success story about how you can use money in politics to win at the state level. And I got to say, if you can dump $250,000 into a little Senate race in the mountains of North Carolina, that has a lot more impact than the millions that the Koch brothers are trying to flood onto the national scene, right? This has a much bigger impact at the state level. And this was an example of how that money could be used. To win over politics. And he had an 80% success rate with the races that he funded, gave Republicans a 10-to-1 advantage, a big factor in going against the grain of a blue trending state, right? That was kind of the aim and the successful mission accomplished. Another key piece to progressive infrastructure in southern states, of course, is the attack on labor and the fact that historically it hasn't been as big of a player and kind of a force in progressive politics in the South, and of course has historic roots, many of them going back to after World War II, and were associated with attacks on civil rights, right, and part of also anti-communism. And so this is the portrait of what labor, of course, calls right to work for less states, right? Where you can be represented by a union, but you don't have to join it. And it leads to this situation where North Carolina, a state with amazing demographic change, it's building progressive infrastructure, has the lowest unionization rate. And so you're missing a key player in trying to influence gain political power in a state like that. And of course, you go down the list for southern states, and the only exceptions being West Virginia, Alabama, state with extractive industries, right, like coal, which also pits them against other players on the progressive scene. And what this translates into, one thing I think, is another way you can define the South. Of course, somebody said poverty as a defining feature, and that's definitely true. And I think the important thing to draw out here, with the recession, right, the whole story of the South was if you just keep unions out, keep taxes low, no environmental laws, jobs will keep flooding in, right? You just get all those burdens out of the way. Well, the recession kind of ended all that, right? Because unemployment soared 10, 11, 12, 13% in these southern states. So this race to the bottom bottomed out. And I think people talk about opportunity. That's an opportunity to talk about what's the new economic agenda for the South. And I think one final defining feature I would say that's a barrier, obviously, is incarceration. And this is the states ranked by incarceration. And we'll definitely send this PowerPoint around, so you don't have to write everything down. But of all the ways, and as somebody mentioned this in the previous panel, I think this is one of those blind spots in the funding world, in the policy world. It's not understanding the fundamental way that criminal justice and incarceration rips apart families, impacts people economically, and impacts politically, of course, with felon disenfranchisement laws. And there was so much progress that was recently made on this front, mostly because states couldn't afford to lock up people as much anymore, right? But now we're seeing a backlash in states like Florida. And you look at the amount of African Americans who are disenfranchised. And you could point to so many factors that could swing an election in a southern state. Having people locked up and not able to vote and having that record that keeps them from voting, I think is one of the biggest factors. Any other barriers people see to realizing the full potential of the Southern New Majority? Anything else that we're missing here?
Restrictions on access to information about sexuality and reproductive health care.
I'm sorry, can you say it one more time?
Restrictions on access to reproductive health services for women and sex education for young people in terms of getting that part of their lives and getting things to be fully politically and otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the big